Good afternoon, everyone. My name is JP Catungal. I'm an assistant professor with the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice, and interim director of the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program at the University of British Columbia. I'm joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in so-called Vancouver, BC. And I'd also like to acknowledge more specifically that my home institution, UBC, is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. When I attend events like this, and when we think about, as we are going to be doing today, Asian Canadian studies and Asian studies, the challenges and opportunities that we experience as folks who are in relationship to these fields and bodies of knowledge, I also want to keep an ethical kind of relationship and proximity to the question of settler colonialism, particularly as it pertains to these formations. And I think particularly with inspiration and political energy from the work of Shireen Razak, Melinda Smith, and Sunera Tabani, who in their 2012 book, States of Race, ask those of us who do critical race studies scholarship in the Canadian context who are non-Indigenous to think about what it means to be thinking about our place when the place itself is stolen. And I hope that is also going to be part of the framework for our conversations about the challenges and opportunities posed by Asian and Asian Canadian studies these days, and the work that we'll be doing today in conversation with the 5 amazing panelists that I'm looking forward to moderating today. So I'll introduce them in turn, or maybe actually ask them to introduce themselves in turn. But for now, I'd like to give you a sense of the kind of scope of the conversation that we will be having today. The description of the event as posted is that today's event is a conversation between students, faculty, and staff from universities with some kind of Asian and Asian Canadian studies programming, and also to think about what it might mean to establish a stronger presence for Asian and Asian Canadian studies in different institutions. And part of this work is also being honest about the kinds of institutional barriers that may exist to restrict the success of existing and also future programs. And so maybe what I'll get our panelists to do is to just introduce yourselves in turn to our audience today. And maybe just from my screen here, I'll start with Amanda.
Thanks, JP, and thank you everyone for joining, whether you're speaking on the panel or you're attending as the audience member. So my name is Amanda. I'm also joining from the unceded and ancestral occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And like JP, I'm also coming from UBC, which is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam people. To sort of continue with this land acknowledgement, I also want to sort of go back to where I was born, which is actually in Scarborough, which is I believe the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and the area some people call Toronto is the territory of Treaty 13, which is signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit along with the Williams Treaties, which was signed by the people of multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And sort of, not to make my introduction too long, but to continue even further, my parents came from Hong Kong, which is a peninsula that many people know for being majority Han Chinese, but is actually built on lands of Hakka, Punti, Tanka, and Hokla peoples who were there on and around the island and in the water. And so I go back that much because I want to think about the land acknowledgement in terms of movement as well, and how we came to these stolen lands as well. So that's sort of my way of trying to work through that. But in terms of what I'm here today for, I'm currently here in a few different capacities. I'm a master's student in English at UBC, and I broadly do Asian diasporic literatures, But I'm also a student staff at the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program, which is a minor undergraduate program at UBC, in which we can talk more about as the conversation goes. Yeah, that's sort of what I'm joining here for today. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'll go with Bailey. Irene.
Hi, my name is Bailey. I'm currently speaking from the lands and territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, and as well as having historical associations within my maternal family within Treaty 3. I am a Japanese Canadian, both personally and as a researcher. I'm interested in the history told through material culture, as well as oral history. And I'm currently working as a research assistant, examining the historiography of Japanese Canadians. And I'm very excited to be here today with everyone else.
Thank you so much, Bailey. Lisa? I think we might be muted, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Var. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Toronto, St. George campus. And I am the granddaughter of immigrants to Canada, 2 immigrants from China, 1 Jewish immigrant from South Africa, and an immigrant from England. And I think that influences somewhat my perspective. Anyway, I don't want to cut our conversation short, so thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Anne-Marie?
Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Lee-Loy. I am the current chair of the English department at the university, soon to be formally known as Ryerson, ex-university, which is, of course, in the Dish with One Spoon territory. I am actually originally from the Niagara region, which, if I remember correctly from my childhood, is part of the territory of the Mississaugas and the Six Nations. I also remember some Anishinaabe as well, knowing some Anishinaabe when I was a child. So I feel that that's the territory that I basically grew up in. My family, so my parents come from Jamaica, which means that we have very complex and tangled biological lines. My grandfather, though, is actually from China, who migrated to Jamaica. So a lot of my research has been in these weird limbo intersecting spaces, which I actually quite enjoy. And so I kind of paused when I was asked to be on a panel that had Asian Canadian as a heading, because I feel that I kind of subvert, go out of, come into different boundaries. And I'm really looking forward. I was listening to Bailey and Amanda to speak before about their experiences as students. So I think we're going to have a really great conversation about how we create and how we can take down some of these boundaries.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. I too am looking forward to it. And last but not the least, Rohini.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Rohini Banerjee, and I'm at St. Mary's University, which is on unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people in Halifax, Squatutuk, Nova Scotia. I've got my fingers in a few different programs in the Faculty of Arts, and primarily I work on the Francophone literatures and cultures of the Indian Ocean, which puts me smack dab in the middle of Africa and India, which makes my work similar to Anne-Marie's interests in sort of the métissage, the blending of being a kid of immigrants from Himachal Pradesh in northern India. So I feel that all of these things feed into our teaching and research, and I look forward to an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohini. And in the kind of interest of also introducing myself a bit more, I'm a first-generation immigrant. My family moved to Vancouver from the so-called Philippines, and I say so-called because the country bears the name of a Spanish king, a testament to the 300 or so years of Spanish colonialism, followed by American imperial presence that arguably continues today. We moved here when I was 13, and I'm also a first-generation academic in my family, coming from a very working class, very usual, common kind of Filipino immigrant background. And I'm also queer, which we'll enter into the conversation later around what I hope to be a conversation about, for instance, intersectionality in relation to Asian Canadian and Asian studies in our institutions. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So let's begin with me perhaps asking a question from our of our panelists to talk about the kind of their experience of the presence or absence or some kind of, you know, something about Asian and Asian Canadian studies in your home institutions, both currently but also perhaps in the past as well. Tell us a little bit about your relationship to these formations in the past and also in the present. Maybe I'll go the opposite order and start with Rohini, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So as I alluded to before, I've got sticky fingers in a few different programs, and that interdisciplinarity, I feel, as a racialized scholar, has helped me understand my own, perhaps my own lived experience as a child born in Canada, as whose parents are like yours, JP, perhaps working class and first academic, asking questions about Asian identity and Asianness and what that means. I've been involved with the Asian Studies program at St. Mary's since I joined in 2007, and it is a program and not a department, and that's important to reiterate, I feel, because we are sort of floating in the Faculty of Arts, always dependent on how our hires are in other departments. So many times, if a department that has a set chair and set funding model looks at a tenure track position, for example, Asian Studies often looks to see if that could be cross-appointed with our program. And so we actually do not have any full-time faculty that are appointed completely to Asian Studies. And this can be challenging on many levels. Some of the work that I've done in Asian Studies have been sort of side topics. As you know, I work in French, so I don't actually have a PhD in Asian history or culture, but a lot of the work that I do within the diaspora of the Indian Ocean works well with some of the post-colonial, colonial identity structures and deconstruction that I'm interested in exploring in my research. So what I can say in the next 5 seconds is that our program is well established. We're the only major that's offered east of Montreal, so we're very proud of that. But it has been primarily focused on East Asia, and we're now slowly generating more and more courses and more actual faculty members to courses that explore the South Asian subcontinent. I myself have taught a Bollywood film course or the culture of Bollywood course a couple of times that have been fairly popular. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rohini. Anne-Marie?
Well, I think, like Rohini, a lot of us, people who are sort of my age or younger, were able to access these type of interests by going through post-colonialism. So I actually began as a post-colonial literary scholar. I remember distinctly because I got to take in fourth year a course on post-colonial literatures, which had never been available before, and I was so excited. And it really just switched the direction of my research. However, I hadn't really thought about doing anything that had anything to do with Asians until I was doing my doctorate. And my supervisor, a man named David Dabadine, if you know his work, had said to me, you need to go do something on the, he saw my last name, and if you come from the West Indies, you would recognize that's a West Indian last name, because our family should be Lee, but because of the colonial experience, we're Lee-Loy. And so he said, you need to go and do something on the Chinese. No one's working on the Chinese in the Caribbean. And I was like, who is this man? And why is he telling me this? This is not why I came to this university to study. But then it was a moment of really sort of maybe this is an opportunity to do that. And so it gave me that chance to really think about questions that I had wanted to think about but had not thought were ways that I, as a scholar, an English scholar, could look at academically. So I had to do all of that on my own, and I'm used to being on my own in the terms of the type of work that I do, which is it's interesting because now at Ryerson or X University where we are, there is really no Asian studies program. There's no Asian Canadian studies program. We have random courses that are sort of spread out in different faculties. So I think that it's an embarrassment, but it's also an opportunity. I think that part of the reason is we're very young in the Faculty of Arts. English is only a degree for 10 years. This is just our 10th years of the program. So there's a real opportunity, if we look at it positively, to rethink how Asian studies might be imagined in the university. And that's why, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, as I've said to the panelists, to rethink how that might be imagined in a university like X University that draws in such a hugely diverse population of students, to really speak to how they are imagining their studies and to build a way for them to do what they want to do and to make a vibrant contribution to the academic and the scholarly field.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We'll go to Lisa.
Hi. I had a kind of interesting path into getting into Asian Canadian and Asian studies history, in that I got into it through Asian American studies. I did an undergraduate degree in the United States and became really interested in the history of Chinese in BC. And just, I would go there every summer to go visit my family, and I just wanted to do that history. And so initially, because I was in America, historians of Asian Americans began to support me in that work and help me begin to sort of read and map out what I would need to learn. And I also drew on American historians and China historians. And it was something that just really piqued my interest, which was to think about Canada in a kind of trans-Pacific and North American transnational way, and kind of to follow the people who migrated around and see the world centered through them. And so that led me then to go to University of Toronto and do a PhD in history, which I did with Timothy Brooke, a China historian, while also doing a major field in Canadian history, and to try to put together the pieces and resources myself, and got a lot of help from the Chinese community as well, and just put that into a project to look at how people who are disenfranchised find unofficial ways to access the political and legal system in Canada using transplanted Chinese means of doing so. That the immigrants I looked at from China in Canada came from a somewhat closed society. So they had ways of figuring out, how do you mediate with a government that's not as accessible as you want it to be? How do you find ways to develop those kinds of relationships and manage? And so that was my first piece of research, and I'm still looking at political questions and looking particularly at Chinese Canadians and Chinese Americans in the Second World War. But I've also developed a kind of cultural interest in the ways that Chinese culture travels and gets reinterpreted diasporically in Canada and in interaction with Canadian religious pluralism. And so that's something I'm still kind of working my way through. But because of that kind of work, I spent the first part of my career as the first faculty member in an Asian American Studies program in Washington, D.C. And sort of grew up as the program grew there, serving the local Asian community in the larger campus. And then after 13 years of doing that, got recruited to UT. And so what I'm going to say about UT is sort of reflected through that experience of going through program building in one set of institutional culture and national culture, and going into another. And so one thing that stunned me about University of Toronto is how much there was in terms of Asian studies and Asian Canadian studies. It was literally a little bit of it everywhere. That not only were there multiple dedicated programs to various aspects of Asian studies. There was the Asian Canadian Studies program that recruited me, but there was also just a presence in many departments of one or a few faculty members, sometimes teaching courses, lots of crisscrossing research networks, and all of it was sort of kind of happening in a very faculty member driven way, that if a department recruited a professor doing something, they'd just teach courses, they'd develop their own networks. It was very organic and very often very siloed, that every department was doing its own thing. And it's interesting to me because after doing my term in Asian Canadian Studies, I'm now actually in a disciplinary department, history, building it from there. So I'm kind of seeing it from both sides. But what was really interesting was just that it was happening everywhere, but it was, I'm not sure how to describe this, but kind of all not really connected. And I think that's a strength, in that there was tremendous diversity in the number of scholars and how it was done, but hard to navigate for students because it was like everywhere ad hoc, and you had to kind of know what was going on in the department to find out about it. And Asian Canadian Studies was a small minor within a small Canadian Studies program that was really special in that it offered small classes at University of Toronto, university known for gigantic mega classes. All of that reputation about the large size is true, but Canadian Studies is a kind of really special exception with kind of personalized approach, some community engagement, and within that kind of small umbrella of this special endowment enhanced program is an Asian Canadian Studies minor, the first in Canada. And so it was just interesting to me that it was so much focused on really, almost a liberal arts approach in terms of saying like a small liberal arts college, like approach to education, which meant there was a tremendous personal attention for students, and it was a real privilege to work with them, but also not as much capacity to serve the larger campus. It was in a sense one way of doing it, but it wasn't meant to displace, say, how contemporary Asian studies or East Asian studies or any of the number of departments that offered courses on their own were doing it. And even though our minors could take courses in other departments, in addition to the courses we offered in Asian Canadian Studies, getting into those courses depended on whether there was any extra capacity. But because those courses were generally really popular within the other majors that they were offered, sometimes there was, sometimes there wasn't. And so it was just fascinating to me to kind of participate in this incredible, intense conversation with a relatively small number of students about Asian Canadian studies, anti-Asian racism, diasporic and transnational perspectives, and try to kind of see where all of this would go. While it was sort of one piece of this larger university picture that was pretty much operating all independently. And that in our satellite campuses, for example, Asian Canadian Studies was not the chosen form, like University of Toronto Scarborough put what we did in Asian Canadian Studies within Global Asian Studies. And so it was a very kind of rich conversation. And one of the things that came out of it is that when I served as Richard Charles Lee Chair in Chinese Canadian Studies, who's also the director of the minor, one challenge was to expand the minor from not only being a part of Canadian Studies, but thinking of Canadian Studies itself as being connected to larger themes, for example, of diasporas, of transnationalism, post-colonialism, just kind of, it was kind of an exciting engagement because it meant when I taught my Canadian Studies courses, I'd take some of these ideas and kind of, do something a little bit, I guess you would say untraditional for Canadian Studies, which is sometimes kind of believed to be very nationalist, and really kind of think about the nation critically, and then kind of bring that Asian Canadian Studies conversation in. And so I feel like the end result of this structure was something that I think has a lot of latitude for those who participate in it. It's sort of flexible and tailored both to the professors and students involved while they're involved. But I also felt like I could see all this exciting work. I looked up the number of MA and PhD dissertations done on Asian Canadian topics and Asian diaspora topics, and I realized that we actually were, by the numbers, had, the year I looked, the most in Canada, and yet, this kind of overarching potential was only connected on almost like a chance basis. And I did at some points try to pull together a research network that got interrupted by illness a little bit, and eventually a lot but I just feel like there's this tremendous opportunity to take all this kind of grassroots experimentation with teaching and researching about the topic in so many different ways and strengthen it. And that what I would love to see is just, the kind of resources put into place to kind of take all of that and make it more accessible, stronger, and better connected, not in any kind of centralized or coercive way, but in a way that just allows all of this to flourish. Because even though there was a lot going on, it still hadn't caught up to the population change. That Toronto's now about a third Asian. Ontario's about a fifth Asian. Canada, the stat I looked at was from the 2016 census, close to a fifth Asian. So that's a lot of catching up to do in terms of research and teaching to be where it logically should be. And I think that's a great opportunity for universities to kind of think about how we train students, the kind of research we want to support for the future. And so I think there's just a lot of exciting potential to build on. And I'm really just happy to be part of it from the 2 units that I connect with, and to just see where it all goes. I do think that year after year, there's more and more critical mass, and that it's a matter of time. Even if, because the university is so huge, things will just, multiple great things could develop. There's not a need to do any one thing, but it does strike me that because we have so many students and they cannot get into the existing classes, that I would absolutely love for all of the units that are doing this work to have the ability to offer the capacity to allow any student who wants to know about Asian Canadians or Asian diasporas or Asia to be able to access a class. I think it's really just part of education for the world we live in now, or at least in the Canada we live in now. And right now, because of the demand, we don't yet have that. And so that's kind of like, that's only part of the picture, because I also think, our university's mission is very research oriented. So, we want students to have contact with that research expertise as well. But I do think it'll be interesting to see where it all goes with that much potential. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lisa. There's a lot of conversations we had also later on about barriers or structural kind of contexts within which we do this work. And I also look forward to hearing more about how we might imagine Asian Canadian studies, Asian studies, and the relationship between those two fields, because some of that relationship is an ongoing negotiation, let's say, and what it might mean to think about them, not just in terms of our own individual institutions, but also as a scholarly formation that is interinstitutional. But I'll go to Bailey and then Amanda to offer their initial set of comments, and then we'll circle back to a conversation about kind of the structural picture within which we are operating. Bailey?
Yeah, of course. So I feel like for me to explain my relationship with Asian Canadian studies, I need to talk a little bit about my family history, which I didn't do in my introduction, and I realize I probably should have. So I am mixed race on my mom's side. My family were United Empire Loyalists that came from the 13 colonies and then settled on the land of Treaty of Tree, which is kind of around the Windsor, Leamington area. And on my dad's side, I'm Japanese Canadian. My family came over in 1907. We settled on the land that is currently British Columbia before my family was interned and then forced to come to Toronto, which is where we now reside in the GTA. So growing up, I was told both of these histories quite a lot, and I was fascinated by both of them. In my head, they were both history. So it made sense to me when I got older that I would study history. There were so many different aspects of it I liked. I liked Civil War history, I liked English history, I liked Japanese history, I liked Japanese Canadian history, I liked just straight Canadian history, War of 1812 history. It was all interesting for me. But as I got older, you know, even by the age of, I would say 9 or 10, I realized that there was a lot of privileging of certain histories over others. The more I would talk about certain histories, the more certain ones would be encouraged and certain ones would be pushed down, and I would be told to repress them or not given the support that I thought they were due, which kind of resulted in, by the time I came to the University of Toronto, I wished to pursue a history major, but I was very certain it would be in either Civil War history or English history, because I had learned by this point that my Japanese Canadian history was not important, and my Japanese Canadian history would not get a voice, regardless of how much I wanted it to. And I kind of proceeded on this thinking until actually I took a course on Canadian history in 100 Objects by Professor Laurie Bertram, and she encouraged me to write one of my papers on my Japanese Canadian history and the way that food intersects with memory, particularly within a community that has almost entirely lost its language heritage due to the Japanese internment, and how food has become sort of a secondary language for this community. And I just thought this blossoming of realizing how important this was. And I kind of realized in my head that, you know, people always talk about my loyalist history. People always prioritize this history. And there are always going to be people that will write over certain kinds of history. But this is a history that people will not be always writing on. And it's important to preserve this and to continue to talk about it. And so that's why I decided to really focus on Japanese Canadian history, because I felt it needed to be told and not everyone was going to do that. And almost immediately once I did that, I started feeling, again, that same feeling I felt as a kid where I wasn't given that support. I kind of figured, I was like, well, it's Canadian history. I'll take a couple of Canadian history courses and I'll study Japanese Canadian history in them because that's Canadian history. And so it should logically be covered in them. And I was constantly like not supported, with the exception of a few teachers, I was not supported in those classes. I was very lucky to have a few teachers that would encourage me to focus on that, but many teachers wouldn't. To the point where actually in my final year, I sent an email to a professor in the history department asking if I could be in her Canadian history course, citing my work on Japanese Canadians as my background. And she told me that I didn't have sufficient background in Canadian history to actually take her course, despite me having worked for about 5 years at this point in Japanese Canadian history and having taken quite a few material culture courses with that. She said that my background was not sufficient in Canadian history. Or I think she called it mainstream Canadian history. There's a certain word, but she told me it wasn't sufficient. And that was a very common response that I got. And so when it took me 6 years to get my degree. And in my 4th year, I actually did try to take an Asian Canadian studies course because I just become so frustrated. And I was frustrated with trying to prove that what I was doing was history when I felt like it shouldn't have to be proven. I was constantly told, oh, you like Japanese Canadian history? Go to the East Asian Studies department. Or like, you like Japanese Canadian history? Study post-colonial studies. And I was like, well, that's great, but why can't I study it in the history department? What's wrong with it? Why can't it be accepted in this department? And particularly the more I learned about how the creation of ethnic studies has been explicitly created as a way for these safe spaces to be used and to be utilized. In my head, in a way, it seemed that although it was a solution, it was potentially a band-aid solution, and I felt a little frustrated. But I did take a course in Asian Canadian studies because just the concept of being able to talk about this work was so exciting. I ended up not staying in the U of T Asian Canadian Studies course at St. George due to a few reasons. I took a few other courses and I had some problems with accessibilities that I was given by some of the teachers, and so unfortunately I wasn't able to continue to use those courses, and after my experiences I did not engage in it afterwards. But in a weird way, the research I do still continues to be highly intersected with Asian Canadian studies. And so I constantly feel kind of a question, because in my head I feel like I constantly fight for my work to be registered, to be accepted as history, to be accepted in the general canon of history, for Asian Canadian history teachers to be accepted within the history department is teaching this work to be able to show this. But at the same time, I also wonder if me doing so is excluding myself from this vast and beautiful network of people working in Asian Canadian studies and creating these beautiful intersections that are that can be so difficult to do, stretching across the nation that is called Canada. And so it's interesting because I both get constantly told I'm an Asian Canadian studies student, and that's one of the reasons I was selected for this panel. But at the same time, I don't really know if I am myself. And so I'm very interested to have this conversation and see where these intersections lie.
Thank you so much, Bailey. Very complicated questions indeed, including the very categories within which we operate. Asian, Canadian, and Asian as categories are, of course, not self-explanatory, even though we sometimes take them to be. They are always in constant negotiation. And I think Rohini and also Anne-Marie, in their own ways, talked about how those categories exclude but also get complicated by multiple diasporic routes. And yeah, so I think it's really important for us to hold on to the complexities of these categories and have an interrogation of the categories within which we operate be part of the, like, a central object of the analysis itself. And we'll come back to that hopefully. Amanda?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll start by talking a little bit about the institutional presence at UBC of Asian Canadian Studies, and then I'll sort of talk more about sort of my entry into it. Also, yeah, what my role is in relation to this institutional presence. So at UBC, we currently do have an Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program. It's an undergraduate minor. And it's relatively new institutionally speaking. I don't remember the exact number of years. It's definitely like something over, yeah, since 2014. And so the actual inception of the program was not necessarily through like internal UBC efforts so much as the efforts of a couple of community organizers, Mary and Tosh Kitagawa, who are Japanese Canadian organizers, currently still very active, and they were actually thinking specifically about the 1942 forced expulsion of Japanese and Japanese Canadian students from UBC due to World War II and Japanese internment. And so they were trying to ask the university to acknowledge that because these students actually hadn't really gotten well, it was, for a lot of people in the community, it was, not considered resolved in any way. And so Mary and Tosh Kitagawa, through a lot of their efforts, I can't even imagine how much, they had to do to get this happening, but somehow through all their efforts, speaking with people at UBC, they were able to they were really able to spur on that creation of the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program. And so it's an interdisciplinary program, which means we don't actually have, we currently have a couple of courses under the course code ACAM, but it actually began and actually mainly continues to be very interdisciplinary in that there are courses from many different departments. So we have things like, of course, like literary courses, which I'm coming in from in terms of discipline. There's the gender, sexuality, race, and social justice and sexuality. First Nations and Indigenous studies. We also have things like theater, sociology. So there's a lot of different routes that people can come in from. At the moment, it's very much arts, like Faculty of Arts based, because that's where the ACAM program is housed. But overall, it's relatively very much drawing from a lot of different areas of interest. And so that's sort of speaking to what people are saying about whether or not they call themselves Asian Canadians or something else. I also have sort of a complicated relation to that, in that I wouldn't say no in terms of identifying with Asian Canadianists or Asian Canadian studies, because I think I am engaging with it a lot and really also indebted to it a lot in terms of what I'm doing. But I'm also drawing from, like, since I came to the program, I'm drawing from a lot of different areas. So currently I'm doing like in the English literature department, but I'm working a lot usually with post-coloniality, queer of color theory. I'm actually also, because I work with like ideas of skin and flesh, I'm also very much indebted to critical Black studies and Caribbean studies. So it is a little difficult to name what I would call myself. So it usually ends up with me going on a very long tangent about what I'm indebted to, what I draw from, what I learn from, what I'm engaging with, which for me is like, I don't know, it's just like, it is really important for me to name those because of the ways that relationality and relationships have really been the forefront of how I engage with these. All this is to say that this institutional presence is interesting because a lot of the time I do see, at least within the Asian Migration Studies program, it's very much driven, like I guess any department or program, it's very much driven by engagements between faculty, staff, and students. So it's hard to say, this is what the program is doing, because a lot of the time it's based on what people coming in are doing or how they're talking to each other and learning from each other and sharing as well. So that, I won't say too much now because I know we have a lot of other questions, but that's sort of where I'm coming from in the context that I'm speaking from.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'll just add a couple of things as interim director of that very program. Just to say also that ACAM's birth as a program is one portion of UBC's acknowledgement of its not just complicity, but active participation in the expulsion of Japanese Canadians. ACAM is one kind of pillar in an institutional kind of acts of contrition, if you will. Maybe that's too dramatic, but there's also the granting of honorary I'm so sorry. Did I cut off there? I did. We have a storm going on in Vancouver right now, so that's probably what's happening. My sincerest apologies. I was just saying that, just repeat my points, that ACAM is one pillar of an institutional response to UBC's kind of active participation in the expulsion of Japanese Canadian students. And that also includes the granting of honorary degrees. And one other thing, principle that is ensconced as a result of that kind of origin story of ACAM is that community engagement has been a kind of central component of the work of ACAM. Supporting that kind of work, particularly through kind of digital storytelling or media production, is another kind of commitment. So I won't say too much more about that so that we have time to ask or answer further questions. And I guess we'll go to the institutional picture. I think so. We've already started talking about that. Not only with the kinds of institutional structures within which Asian Canadian or Asian Studies appears, but also, what are some of the barriers that we might encounter in our attempts to continue growing institutionally, if that's, the goal at all. The presence of Asian and Asian Canadian Studies. I'll just begin by talking about the one institutional picture at UBC that Amanda alluded to, which is that we are a minor program that draws on faculty members courses in other units for the most part. And so a lot of us, I'm borrowed, for example, from the Social Justice Institute, bought out to be able to teach in an ACAM coded course, which means that we are in many ways beholden to other units' capacity to let people be borrowed, which poses some capacity issues and also requires work to ensure that relationships with other units are smooth so that we can continue to have that relationship. And then the other is the presence, much longer presence of Asian studies at UBC. It's a full-on department with majors and graduate programs. And then Asian Canadian Studies is much newer, just an undergraduate minor. And so there's been some kind of like the relationship between those two units is also, let's say in constant negotiation, also in terms of capacity, for example, but also in terms of defining the scope of what kinds of curricular pieces get to be, I guess we can call it very inelegantly as like whose turf is the diaspora and Asian Canadian and Asian Canadianness within the presence of these two fields. So anyway, that's part of our experience at UBC institutionally. And I was wondering if folks can say a little bit about theirs. And maybe I'll go back to Rohini to tell us a little bit more about. You've already begun to do so, Rohini.
I did, yeah. Thank you, JP. Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm listening and learning from all of you, so it's been an interesting circle listening to all of you. I feel that back to the fact that we are a program, we have to hunt for people to deliver our courses. And what happens with that, from a logistics point of view, for someone like myself who's appointed in modern languages and classics in the program of French to teach X number of French language, literature, culture courses, I have to go and say to my chair, can I go teach an Asian Studies course? And that means that there's a gap for having a racialized woman faculty member to teach a grammar class. And for me, that's very important that my French students see someone like myself teaching French grammar. And that's a whole other panel that we can talk about later, francophonie du monde and all of that. But it's really, I feel torn often because I want to teach these classes, but I want to ensure that my home program, my home department doesn't lose out on having a racialized faculty member. Well, maybe we should be hiring more racialized faculty members. That's always a great opportunity to say, hey, I don't think there's enough of us here. So let's perhaps do that. I'm a former faculty union president, so I've got some interest in making sure that we've got cluster hires or targeted hires. So often I have to sort of go in and around this time, actually, in November, when we're discussing scheduling for next year, is Rohini going to be teaching a class in international development or Asian studies or women and gender? Like, are we going to lose her again out of my teaching load? So that's challenging, and that puts many of us who are interested in Asian studies in a precarious position because we sort of have to ask to do the work, and there is an emotional labor that's attached to that. And so when I do get an opportunity to teach a course like Interdisciplinary Study of Asia, I warn students that if they take it with a historian, the historian is going to give them a particular point of view, but the literature person over here is going to infiltrate their brain with lots of literature and lots of literary theory. So just be warned that my version of Interdisciplinary Study of Asia is going to look a little different. And one of the other things, if I can add in before we go back to the rest of us, rest of the group, is also where does Arabic sit? And that's been a really interesting conversation that we've been having. We are in modern languages and classics, and we're decolonizing the title of our department because there's no such thing as a modern language, especially when we're teaching Chinese and Japanese in our department. And so Arabic has always been in this conundrum, like where do we place Arabic? And, as I teach an intercultural studies course as well. And in that course, debunking the language of the Middle East and using terms like Western Asia, and getting students and colleagues to stop calling the area the Middle East and using terms like Western Asia, and opening their own point of view of what it means to be Asian. And actually led a panel back in May during Asian Heritage Month on what it means to be Asian, and sort of the unpacking of the term Asian and how problematic that really is. And what is our sort of first go-to, going back to JP's point of turf, when it comes to Asia, what our students think that means, what happens when we add Arabic to that, what happens when we bring in, the Maghreb, for example, in Northern Africa, does that become part of Asia? Who decides where the Asian line begins and starts? Those are all questions as we globalize and decolonize. So I'm really interested to see how decolonization intersects with how we perceive Asian studies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on that note of, asking even more questions, perhaps to introduce another language to queer the very kind of categories that we make use of, in my own kind of presence in Asian Canadian studies, both broadly, but also institutionally, ensuring that the conversation around Asian and Asian Canadian studies is not also just about race or ethnicity or language or region, but also about gender and sexuality and class. I know that we are concurrent with another session specifically on gender and sexuality, but I want to make sure that I also want to shout out that I, like Amanda, also approached this work through Queer of Color scholarship and a kind of comparativist Queer of Color scholarship. My PhD work was also on East, Southeast, and South Asian, and also Black community organizing in HIV/AIDS in Toronto. Actually, I'm a U of T alum as well. So that also too is part of the way that I hope we are kind of thinking about the complexity of these categories. So thank you for prompting me to think about that as part of this conversation, Rohini. I'll go to Anne-Marie.
So that was great listening to what Rohini and Lisa were saying about how their programs work, because that can help us avoid some pitfalls as we think through some of these questions here at X University. Since we don't have an Asian studies or an Asian minor, I'll just speak a little bit about the Faculty of Arts has just done its first a Black Studies minor. And the approach to that was to have a foundation course, and then students had the freedom to go all across the university, just like Lisa was describing, to access these courses that are being offered by different faculties. And the beauty of that, I am seeing now by listening to you speak, is that we don't borrow people, we don't draw people away from their departments. They are teaching in their departments. So the question then is going to be how to give students access to these courses, to really have people think, what are the prereqs? What are the barriers that you're putting up that would allow somebody from sociology not to get into something in creative industry, or take somebody in English who really wants to take a course, somewhere else, maybe science or something like that, right? So we have to, I think really carefully about how accessible these courses are on a broad level to our students. But I really think that I'm liking the idea of not having courses coded as an Asian minor course, that unless they're cross-coded, so that people stay within their departments and you're not having that resource issue. Because resources, I think, is going to be the biggest problem. I mean, I love that Rohini just said, why aren't we hiring more people? And for me, I don't even phrase it as hiring more people, because then you can feel people get tense, right? Like, oh, what do you mean you're gonna just look for people of color? But I mean, you're looking for people who have the knowledge to refresh your curriculum. And, it just happens that these are the people who are going to be usually studying in these areas. So think about that. Like, what is the knowledge base that you need, and advertise for that knowledge base. So I think it's really exciting, and I think that I'm getting a little bit more comfortable with the idea of naming a minor. And then the other reason why I really want a named minor for us here at X University is because I think that that inspires people, number one, to create courses, to feel like, oh, they have a home. And number two, it gives some leverage when you're asking for hiring as well, to say we can participate in this initiative as well. One of the things that really helps, and I'm glad Amanda and Bailey are here, and I'm hoping that there's students out there, but one of the things that really helps is when students start to bring pressure on the administration for what they want. So I really hope that that message comes out, because sometimes we can imagine things as faculty members, we can imagine these wonderful initiatives, but sometimes it's to make it sound very crass, you know, it's an administration saying, oh, but the students are asking for it. Okay, let's pursue that, as opposed to, okay, there's this random faculty member who thinks this is a good idea. So there has to be this sort of coming together to make it accessible, to make it flexible, and to make it vibrant for students as well. So those are the things I'm thinking of institutionally while I'm listening to you talk.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And on that note, maybe I'll mess with the order a little bit and ask Amanda to say something about our ACAM dialogues, the history of ACAM dialogues at UBC. And I ask in part because ACAM dialogues is a student-led, student-run series of dialogues about Asian Canadianness, about race, about intersectionality at UBC. And one of the amazing things that it's done through this student-led initiative is that it's become, you know, an opportunity for us to identify areas and topics and issues that students really want curriculum on. So for example, I'm teaching a course on Asian Canada and popular culture right now, ACAM 250. And that is a direct effect of a dialogue series on sexual violence in Asian Canadian communities, where students really wanted a course on, you know, the gendered representations of Asianness in popular culture. So yeah, maybe I'll ask Amanda to say a bit more about that.
Sure, yeah, thank you for contextualizing that as well for us. Yeah, so the ACAM Dialogue series is basically, well, I like to say it's a discussion event series, hence the name ACAM Dialogues, but also we've included a lot of different forms such as podcast episodes, film screenings, workshops, and so it began when a staff member named Stephanie Fung was actually in my current role at the ACAM program, and she saw the need for, she saw the conversation that was existing actually there on campus around sexual violence, and wanted to provide a space for students to talk about that in terms of Asian Canadian and Asian migration studies, and just also like Asian diaspora. And so she began the discussion series, which was, yeah, again, student-led, student-focused. And then later on, when I joined the ACAM team, we continued it. So we've talked about things, or we've had overarching themes such as mental health in Asian Canadian communities. We've talked about, well, currently we're also talking about anti-racism on campus. And so we switched it up a little bit to become more of a cohort model where a smaller group of students, undergraduate and graduate, get together once per month to talk about different materials. So not just course scholarship, written scholarship, but also other things like films, museum exhibits, artwork, things like that. And so, yeah, that is one interesting way that I think I've seen students voicing their interests, myself being both a student and a staff member. I think that's always really fascinating. I think it also, just to speak to the question, I guess as well, like I think it also, to some extent, speaks to the institutional barriers insofar as a lot of the time this voicing is necessary because there's, you know, these relationships are happening, but there may not be as much institutional support. So what do I mean by that? I guess, for example, I'm thinking about how, like, as I think Lisa was saying, you know, you often see where people are doing their things, but maybe in different areas, or maybe they're networking, but it's not, institutionally supported or made as publicized as well. So I want to acknowledge that, these relationships have always been happening in some way or another, and people have been talking about these things. It's just not always supported in the same way or in the same scope. And so I think one of the institutional barriers to me, along with what everyone has already said, like really brilliantly, is that a lot of the time universities or institutions in general turn it into an issue of like representation, which is important as well, obviously, super powerful and meaningful for a lot of people. But when we end it at representation of identity, then it ends up being, okay, we'll get X number of students this year to join our department, and then after they're here, there's no support for them. I think that's an issue. We see a lot at UBC where we do actually have a lot of racialized student presence, but then there's not very much institutional support for them once they get into the program. So we have staff, faculty, and students who are racialized and or doing this kind of work, but then we're not getting the support that we need to sustain this, right? Like a lot of times I'm hesitant to even ask my like my peers or like faculty or mentors to continue doing this work, because as JP has mentioned, there's a lot of capacity questions, right? So a lot of things that make it actually hard for us to continue building these relationships with each other, where they sometimes do happen. So yeah, that's sort of what I would say to that.
Perfect. Lisa, did you want to add to the conversation? I think we're muted.
The issue of institutional support that Amanda raised, I think, is a key piece to work on, and that can be helped by relatively modest resources to help support building community and ensure that people who are taking on a lot of things are minimally burdened by participating in research groups or networks or other kinds of mutual support, especially across silos. But I do want to keep in mind the capacity issue, and that everyone has a limited amount of time, so support does matter. I think the other issue, and this is something Anne-Marie mentioned, was simply that doing an interdisciplinary program as an overlay on existing other departments, you mentioned that also, Rohini, is always an ongoing balance and negotiation. And I think from my experience in Asian Canadian studies, it was a tough one. That there was one faculty member, the lead chair, who was the designated tenure track faculty member to teach some core courses that would try to tie together everything on campus and meet the kind of interdisciplinary needs of students. And then after that, a sessional course taught by a visiting lecturer, and then whatever we could get. And because that was often determined by the needs of other departments, it fluctuates. And also the issues of capacity, whether there's extra room, and also prerequisites, because I'm now on the other side of it, teaching entirely in history. And now suddenly I realize if I have no prerequisites on my third year course, then I can't actually provide challenging assignments to the students in my own discipline. And that actually makes a huge difference as far as the quality of historical work students can do and how interesting it is for them. And so there are lots of dilemmas to negotiate. I also got switched to teaching Asian history of Asia, basically, when I moved over to history. And that's changing next year. But I have to do my part for the larger curriculum, as we all do once we're in a different unit. And so I think that all of that, I think, is something that in the end requires a certain amount of institutional commitment to allow the member departments or participating departments at least be compensated, so that if someone is borrowed, then there's someone to cover whatever need that was. And that, I think, is something that I would love to see happen. I would love to see university presidents step up and say, excellent Asian Canadian studies, everywhere it should be supported, figure it out, and we'll support people participating in this. And that would, I think, free up lots of different people in lots of ways. It would take not only the, say the president, but middle management as well to kind of make all of the very complicated trade-offs work, and it would always be complicated. But I think without that, there are just really some daunting structural issues and also pedagogical issues in terms of how do you teach to so many different levels. And when I was in Asian Canadian studies, it was continually trying to balance that. And I'm actually kind of, feel like it's something that comes with every interdisciplinary program. It's a given. But I think it's also something to just think about intellectually with colleagues in the other participating departments to try to increase how complementary the parts of the puzzle are, if possible. But that kind of time investment can only be done really with long-term employees. You can't ask someone who's going to teach the course once to invest all of that time figuring out how the course can, say, meet the requirements of multiple units so that everybody who's contributing gets maximum value. That takes, kind of a, at least a medium-term investment. And that is pretty much how we've kind of finessed Asian and Asian Canadian studies. Our students take each other's courses. We are happy about it all around. They can do research projects on either side. And certainly in history, if someone comes to me and they want to do an Asian Canadian studies, extended research project, and it's wholly Canadian, great. If it's wholly in an Asian or Asian diasporic context, great, both. I feel like it's, it's just something that's quite, how we do things is quite flexible, but I think when it comes to actually where people are working, that's structural. And that's where I think the big challenge is for growing interdisciplinary programs in a university that's made up largely of discrete departments. And so I think overall, it pretty much what I've encountered is, I think, echoed by the other panelists, but in our own version at UT.
Thank you, Lisa. Bailey, did you want to add?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, as a student, I don't have as much experience with how the faculty and the departments are set up and how the units are taught. That's not really what I know, but maybe I can give a bit of perspective of some struggles that students sometimes face when it comes to wanting to take Asian Canadian studies. So I guess the first one is that a lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of students don't really know it exists, which I wish they did. I worked a lot in Asian Canadian theater throughout my whole university career, and I worked with a lot of other Asian Canadian activists, a lot of Asian Canadian students were all interested, and a lot of them didn't know Asian Canadian studies was even an option. And indeed, I didn't know about it for 3 years out of my degree. I didn't know it was a thing. We all knew East Asian studies was an option. So for most people, that's what everyone would take. And on top of that, there was the fact that because it is a minor, a lot of people felt that if they really wanted to do anything else, it would be difficult to do this as well, especially because there's always the concern whether or not courses would cross over and be accepted on both sides. I know that was something I constantly worried about with history, as I was always worried that some of my courses that I took in Asian Canadian studies would not necessarily cross over properly, and I was a history specialist. So even though in my head I'm like, well, they're both history, so it should count. It's the same problem with East Asian studies. It might be Japanese history, but if it's being taught in East Asian studies, it's not going to be counted as a history course necessarily on the other side. Or you have to fight to make it count, which has also happened a few times. So a lot of times I found that could scare off a lot of my friends that were looking at it as well, where they felt like, well, I would like to take this, but I'm taking an English specialist, or I'm specializing in this, and like I just don't have room to make it work. Or even though I agree that it is a part of it is literature, but it's not being viewed like that by the university. So that was very, very frustrating for a lot of students. I think there's also, as I'm looking at grad schools and I'm in the process of applying to grad schools in the moment, I'm also running into the issue of dealing with that intersectionality between the different departments, because I might love a professor's writing and I might think, well, they're teaching history, I would love to do my degree with them. But if I want to do my degree in history and say it's a UBC prof at the Asia Institute, that doesn't work. They won't let me do that. And so then I have to think, well, where does my degree actually rest? And so it becomes very complicated because, unfortunately, we still need to continue these dialogues between different departments. And until that exists, it really forces students to kind of pick and choose, unfortunately, which is kind of the antithesis of what I feel like in my mind Asian Canadian Studies is, which is welcoming the fact that there's so many different ways to approach the same topic. And there's so many, like, in a way, it's exploring the beauty of connecting various minds and approaches and experiences through academia and allowing them to blossom into something that is less restricted by the traditional departments. But unfortunately, I feel like there still exists, at least within students' mindsets, if not in reality, this need to pick and choose what they're actually going to do when it comes to choosing between Asian Canadian Studies versus a conventional department. And I feel like maybe if there was more information on that, if that is not the case, that would be really helpful. And if that is the case, then regarding that, I think could really change a lot of students' minds on whether or not they pursue it.
I am well aware of time. I think we are scheduled for 6:20, aren't we? 6:20 Eastern, which would be in 5 minutes, which doesn't give us a lot of room for audience questions, but I will ask the audience, I'll prompt the audience to ask questions in the chat if you do have them. But in the meantime, in the last 5 minutes, well, 4 minutes that we have, maybe I can just ask folks to very quickly say something about what they hope to be the future of Asian and Asian Canadian studies. If you had a wish for Asian and Asian Canadian studies, what would it be? Sounds very pageant question, but here we are. And maybe I'll begin with Amanda, and then Bailey, and then Anne-Marie, Rohini, and Lisa.
Sure, that's an excellent question, also really big. So I'm going to say what I can think of,
huge,
but
sorry.
obviously, no, it's okay, it's great. I love it. Actually, no, maybe that's great because I think like, I think in some ways people have been alluding to this in terms of like how structural reconfigurations can happen, but also just how we conceive of Asian Canadian studies. And I think it'd be really great if there was that. If there is that space, or also like valuing of the work that's being done and continues to be done, whether or not it is legible to the institution. I think that's one thing that's really important because, of course, institutional reconfigurations take time, but within that time, then like how are we all treating each other and how are we feeling within these structures? So I don't know exactly how that would look yet, but I would definitely like to see that happening, where it's very much focused on, like how we can sort of reconfigure, I guess maybe to some extent reconfigure like the culture of what's academia or scholarship means, and sort of like foregrounding how much labor, intellectual, psychic, emotional, political labor this all takes just to even do this work, whether or not it's named by institutions. So that's my hope.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Bailey?
Yeah, so I guess at first I really want to talk about how far Asian Canadians, particularly from my experience, I'm speaking about East Asian Canadians and Japanese Canadians, just to be fully clear on that, have come within academia. Like I think about my great uncle was one of the UBC students that was taken out of UBC due to the internment, and he ended up finishing his degree east of the Rockies because that was the only place. And UBC turned him down when he applied for a master's because he was Japanese Canadian. And I remember when he received his honorary degree. And so for my family to go from that to me being able to talk about aspects of about Asian Canadian studies, which exists at my university, and talk about what could be improved, that's such an incredible trajectory that's happened, and I feel like that really needs to be acknowledged. I feel like within that, really what my wish is for Asian Canadian studies is that ethnic studies is always a very complicated thing because when you look at its history, it's thrown at like, especially, you know, the original creation of ethnic studies within America and then how that progressed into Canada and then kind of the intersection between the two countries. Like, it's a very complicated thing. It's a lot of nationalistic elements from it. It's a lot to do with the Cold War. There's a lot of ghettoization of certain forms of academia and prioritization of certain forms of academia over others. And so really what I look at when I see Asian Canadian studies and what I hope for in the future is to be a place where not so much students are forced to go to because there is no other option. I don't want it to be something that's like, well, the university won't accommodate me, but luckily they have this one department, so I can take my minor in it at least. I want it to be a place where this intersectionality, which is blooming within Asian Canadian studies, is this incredible thing. So it's not so much the students are going there because there is no option for them in history or in literature, and they're not feeling like they're pushed towards the department. They're going there because they're like, this is a totally new way of learning that we can examine, and we can really thrive in the intersectionality and connections of our communities. So I guess what I'm saying is I really hope that it becomes less a Band-Aid solution for the lack of existence within other departments and more an opportunity for intersectional learning for what it truly is.
Thank you so much, Bailey. I am aware of time. I don't know what to do. I feel stuck because I also still want to hear from Rohini and Anne-Marie and Lisa about it. So maybe we'll do it very quickly. We'll just clear time. And Anne-Marie, then Rohini, then Lisa in turn.
Okay, I'll just say I would like to see Asian Canadian studies as being comfortable being a solidarity of mess. I just think we should enjoy the chaos. I think we should enjoy the movement. I think we should enjoy the flexibility. And that's all I'm going to say on that topic.
Thank you so much, Rohini.
I want to say that I was invited for a conference in Cape Breton in northern Nova Scotia on coastal communities, where I gave a talk on the Maritime Bunger Group and the history of activism within Asian Canadian communities. That excites me. So I think there's more and more stuff to do that really intersects all kinds of different things. So I'm all about flexibility.
Thank you, Rohini. Lisa.
I concur with the other panelists. I would love to see Asian Canadian studies topics just sort of be everywhere, not be like a missing piece, not be, oh, it's a heritage program or something. And for where it occurs to be that exciting intersection that drew me to it in the first place, not having to decide, am I doing Canadian history? Am I doing Asian diasporas? To be able to be an interdisciplinary historian and to be in dialogue with a lot of other people who are kind of approaching similar questions and working through community work in different ways. And so I think there's room for something really special that's not filling a gap, but giving something more.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. That all of that is a perfect way to. And thank you so much, everyone, for indulging my humongous ending question there. But I think it was actually I really enjoyed your responses. I think they gesture to the kinds of hopes that we all have in terms of Asian and Asian Canadian studies and the possibilities for the future. I'd like to thank each of you for everything that I've learned today and your individual contributions and also our conversation. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us in this conversation. And I look forward to learning more from everyone who is involved in this national forum. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. And that the rest of the forum goes well. Take good care.